The good thing is, in the interest of variety, I'm not talking about blockchain, cryptocurrencies, or anything like that. My topic is on fintech generally and digital banking, which are two very important topics and two topics that are very close to my heart. So a little bit about me. I work as an advisor for 3 accelerator programs. One is called Startup Bootcamp, Supercharger, and I also do some work for Yes Bank as well. So I advise startups, mostly on product, mostly on strategy. I also act as an intermediary between the startups and the banks. Having worked for corporates, having worked for startups, I can see where the problems lie. And given my experiences, I try to help these guys along. So it's a little bit about me. So I'll just run through my slides very quickly. I'm conscious that people want to get home and everything, so I'll try and be quick. So what is fintech? So a lot of people kind of ask me this question on a daily basis, I have to say. And the term has been around for a while. I can recall it coming up in conversation in 2009, so post the financial crisis that we had back in 2008. And essentially what it means is that we are using tech to better enable products and services for customers. And typically, I play in the BFSI space, so the focus has always been on banking and banking products and solutions. And obviously, fintech companies, startups, can do things a lot quickly compared to banks. I use my own experiences working for RBS in London, and we were hideously slow at getting products out the door. But banks are generally like that. That's how they work. They're governed by regulation and compliance, whereas fintech companies generally aren't to a certain degree and can be nimble in certain cases. They are typically startups, so they either fall into people who have worked for corporates and become disillusioned and want to make a difference, and the other are young guys who are looking to kind of make a name for themselves in business, have a great idea they want to follow through on. So those are the kind of buckets that startup guys fall into. And the other thing as well is that originally it was a position that fintech startups were there to compete with banks. That might have been the perception a long time ago, but I think certainly now that is changing now. And we're looking more at working collaboratively with these guys in order for the greater good of the consumers. So what's really driven fintech? Well, I think consumers, ultimately. I mean, as consumers of many products and services, collectively in this room, I'm sure we all have expectations and demands from our service providers. And of course, those who bank, a number of global banks around the world, we have similar expectations from our financial products too. Convenience, choice, variety, the way in which products are presented, the experience, these are all important things. And consumers have really driven that, hence why fintech companies are there to kind of play onto that. They realize that banks have certain limitations, and they can come in and try and make some kind of difference. And by and large, that's where they focused on. So it could be working on a blockchain-based solution, or it could be the way in which a UI is presented, or the experience in which a consumer has to go through, on board and use the product. The growth of fintechs, I think, really it centers around innovation. So a fintech company exists because they've spotted a gap, they've spotted an idea that they can play upon, and which it's underpinned by the innovation side of things. There are two kind of schools of thought, really. When you go to a fintech event generally, and there are many around the world, what people will tell you is that there are certain problem statements that exist, known. So we all know that these are genuine issues. So typically how it works is that startups will look at those problem statements and try to address them. Now, they could be very basic and simple things, or they could be very complex things, depending on how you look at it. So that's one route. The other route is that they will try and find a problem statement to build upon. And that's the toughest part. If I have a list of 20 problem statements already in hand, they're in black and white, I'm kind of partway there. But the challenge then is to try and find that gap and build upon it. And obviously then get the subsequent buy-in, investments, and so on and so forth. That's really driven, I think, the growth of fintech, for the last, 5, 6 years plus, actually. So, the work that I do at Startup Bootcamp, we run an accelerator program where we onboard fintech companies, so very young companies that come on board. And these are some of the areas that are typically fintech focused. Blockchain, obviously, we've talked about all day today, but there are other areas where fintech companies look to focus on. And you can see them all there. So you have guys that will have an idea, and by and large, that idea will fall into one of these categories in some way, shape, or form. And most accelerators will play in broadly this space here in terms of focal areas. Okay, so what's influencing fintech? So I've kind of written down 5 things that I think are quite crucial in all this. Number 1, of course, is innovation. So we've talked about how important that is in order to drive new product development, drive new experiences, plug holes, plug gaps, creativity, and so on. The cloud and the data that we consume and how that's managed is very important. So, lots of cloud service providers here. We've utilized it now for a good number of years. That's not going to change. Convenience and variety. So, of course, as consumers, a couple of things that we demand, really, in terms of products and services. They're convenient and we have a choice. Government support. Now, this is quite crucial. We had a government representative here. Whatever we do in the fintech world is underpinned by the government and the regulator. So in the BFSI sense, the central bank and the government really should be driving a lot of this. You all can drive it to a certain degree, but you're kind of stifled because you need their guidance and their support. I worked in Singapore for 2 years. I mean, we've talked about where Singapore is at. It's a great ecosystem. It's a great hub. It's a relatively small place to work generally, and it's very easy to do things in Singapore. India, yeah, there are challenges. There are big challenges. So you do need the government buy-in, but they need to realize it themselves as well. And I think there's probably a perceived lack of understanding in certain areas where they themselves need help, I think. And of course, as we move through the generations, the technology moves with it, consumers change. I'm 38 years old, but I still think like, a 21-year-old in terms of technology. These guys can make or break everything that you do from a product perspective. The demands that we had when we were growing up are vastly different to what the generation now have and are thinking. So there are different customer segments. I'm not going to bore you with a consultancy slide, but you have millennials, you have Generation Z, and then you've got upcoming Generation Alpha, which are the kind of the younger generation. These guys have grown up with digital. I've been fortunate enough to see the sort of stages of evolution of tech. It's been brilliant. These guys haven't. They've grown up in this digital world. So therefore, as organizations, we need to kind of be in tune with their wants and their needs. Okay, so fintech has been around for a while, as I said. So what's the future beyond 2018 and up to 2020, let's assume? So one of the big problems that fintech companies have historically had is scale. I think I read an article on Forbes recently that 90% of fintechs that start out fail. That's largely because of the fact that they haven't got this subsequent investment. And it all comes down to the problem that you're trying to address. I think the gentleman earlier talked about having the problem and focusing on that before building the solution. And a lot of these fintech guys fall over because they haven't really thought about it. I went to an event in September last year, a blockchain event. I was on a panel and I talked about blockchain globally, very general. And a bunch of guys afterwards said, we want to use blockchain. I said, well, you don't really need to use it. There are other solutions you could potentially use. So that's pretty critical. Investment and growing revenues, if they already have a product in place, are going to be quite challenging for these guys. Fintech hubs. Now, there are lots of fintech hubs. I can name a handful. So New York, London, Singapore, Hong Kong, Bangalore, to a certain degree here in India, is considered widely considered a fintech hub. These are pretty critical in terms of driving the ecosystem. So fintech hubs generally consist of the good things surrounding legislation, regulation, talent, the number of startups that exist, they're nurtured, and so on and so forth. Fintech hubs need to carry on with that, but there needs to be a wider collaboration in order for that to prosper. Now, what I mean by that word collaboration is very important. As a fintech company, I can build my own product, I can do things, but I need to collaborate if I'm working in the BFSI world with a bank, and vice versa. And that collaboration needs to continue into this year and beyond if we are to see the success within these fintech hubs. There are lots of them, as I say. In terms of 2018, I think this collaboration piece is very important. Investment as well is also quite critical. So a number of investors that are looking to put their money into fintechs is becoming very difficult now. Years ago, investors were literally throwing their money at you, right, because they wanted to get on the bandwagon. What's happening now is that money's drying up. You really need to think about your idea, your business case, your plan before you go to an investor. I can tell you now that, as someone that's invested in startups, it's quite tough. They're actually now counting the pennies, whereas before they weren't doing that so much. So that's another challenge that these guys need to have and think about. And I think if we look beyond 2018, 2-3 years down the line, I think fintech will still exist. It's not going to go away. I think the number of startups that you see now will probably dwindle, and there might be a consolidation exercise that will happen at some point in the future. I don't know. That's just my assumption. But it'll be an interesting period to see how things develop from now in terms of, as I say, the number of people that are building their own companies, number of startups that exist, and the ones that actually get, are successful in their own right and not acquired by a bank or, not taken over by someone in particular. Okay, so that was fintech. All right, I want to talk about digital banking. How many people here work in the digital banking space, just out of curiosity? Or are a payment tech company that are involved in banking? Okay, all right, a couple here. So digital banking has been around for a while. It's nothing new, per se. But, there's a key line here. Most CEOs, most CDOs now, what they want to do is become a true digital bank. And there are different tiers of banks. You've got the big tier ones, the big international banks, and you've got the tier 2, tier 3, tier 4. They're all at different stages in terms of their evolution of digital. I'd even argue that some of them don't even know what digital means. Tier 1 banks typically are kind of doing a lot of them stuff themselves. They started out as tier 2, tier 3, but they've obviously evolved to become tier 1s, and they've learned how to do certain things from other companies. I worked for a company in Singapore that acted as a platform provided to banks to become digital. And the tier 1 banks learned what we did, how we did it, and then decided to take it in-house and do it themselves. Whether they're doing a good job, of course, remains questionable, but they've learned to kind of adapt and go it alone. The tier 2s, tier 3s, tier 4s are still learning, so they need support to a certain degree. So what is digital banking? I've kind of summed it up. I didn't want to make the slide too busy, but essentially it's anytime, any place, any channel. So I can do my banking, or I can do my banking at home, I can do my banking at work, I can do it on the phone, I can do it online, and so on and so forth. That's what it means. The term's omni-channel. It's been around for a while, but essentially that's what it is. Better banking beyond traditional services. So we have a product, but we also have a UI and an experience. That's pretty critical for an app or an online service. If I can't use it, then I'm not going to use it. I'll look for someone else that can provide that solution to me. And that's pretty critical now in terms of the generation that we have in place, the younger generation now. That's what they demand. So whether it's on a phone, on a tablet, online, the experience needs to be intuitive, friendly, and, more importantly, consistent as well. Contextual services. So this is, again, contextual commerce, contextual services. It's been talked about for a while. Is anybody doing it right? I don't think so. Do they know what it means? I don't think so either. But contextual services actually is pretty critical. because that implies that an organization knows you and knows what you need very well. And that's derived from the data that they have on you. And of course, there's all these questions about data privacy and so on and so forth. But in order for you to be loved by your service provider and presented with meaningful offers, meaningful services, as a consumer, you'd value that. I'll be like, okay, my bank knows me very well. If I apply for a credit card with a bank, should I need to fill in all these forms if they already know who I am? They've presented me with an offer, great, and it's relevant to me, but then I have to go through this exercise of form filling and so on. Do they really know? Do they really know me? I question that if I have to go through this process. So the whole context piece is very important. Understanding your consumer, understanding everything about them in order to present a meaningful service. And that's not just a banking, it could be any service provider. And of course, all of that combined equates to digital banking. Okay. Everything evolves, as we know. So this is a good slide. This was actually provided to me by the Financial Brand, who are a great online news source. And I like the illustration, and it kind of sums it up pretty well. So pre-digital, we had mainframes, we had branches, we had ATMs, and we had batch processing. Then we moved on to 1.0, which is kind of where we're at now, to a certain degree still, which is social, mobile, analytics, and cloud. And now we're at the stage of digital 2. Different phases, I guess, but banks are now making use of AI as a tool, robotic process automation at the back end to help speed things up, provide efficiencies, and so on and so forth. IoT in banking is being looked at as well through the use of wearable devices, connected devices, and so on and so forth. Blockchain we've talked about, and of course open banking, which has recently come into play in Europe. So that's the kind of timeline of the evolution of digital banking. So digitization, only the beginning. So these are 4 pretty critical points, I think. So the issue with banks, as I see it, and having worked for a bank and having known the complexities, and there are complexities at the back end, the banks won't tell you this, probably because they're afraid. But a lot of the problems exist at the back end for banks. Historically, they have lots of systems in place, core banking systems, retail banking, corporate banking, private banking, and so on and so forth, that are very, very old and very, very cumbersome and complex. Imagine a pile of wires, you have at home. They're all tangled up. Typically, some systems are like that. I worked for a telco in the UK. They had 500 systems. Imagine that, 500 systems. None of them talk to each other. It was a mess. Large organizations have become complex because of that problem. Now, what happens critically at the front end is linked to the back end. So I can create a lovely fancy app. I can really amaze you guys with it. You'll be like, oh, wow, this is great. But if it doesn't work, then that's a problem. And by and large, it's normally connected at the back because it hasn't been configured correctly. So of course, as a consequence, some banks have tried to go digital but not seen the ROI on that. And that's linked to the first point. I've talked about, in the third bubble there, the lack of investment as well has kind of hindered them to a certain degree. Lack of investment, lack of understanding. They don't want to touch it. If I look at a mess, I'm like, well, I'll leave that. I'll go and do something else. That hasn't helped either. And of course, you want to try to fix things very quickly as human nature. As humans, we want to try and just get things done and try and move on. And banks have tried to do that. But obviously, as a result of that, you have issues with APIs, connectivity, and then obviously open banking comes along and can change all that for you as well, increase the competition and so forth. So these are what I consider to be 5 key areas within a digital solution. Right? So you have your devices. So these could be smartphone, tablet, wearable, online even. You have your channels. You have your model banking verticals. So those are focused on retail, corporate, and private, which is where a lot of the banks tend to focus. You have your banking applications. And then critically, you have something called your UI UX platform. This is an area where a lot of organizations actually, in fact, in today's world, tend to struggle. And it's actually the most important because your UI and your UX, your journey, so to speak, really can make or break you. I don't bank in India. I can't really bank in India, unfortunately, because I'm not a citizen as of yet, and I don't have the requisite paperwork. But I've used banking apps here, and I've used banking apps in Singapore and in the UK, where I'm from. I have to say that the user experience on some banks here in India is actually pretty bad. You know, it's not been well thought out and perceived. I'm not a UX and UI guy per se, but I'm benchmarking it against other apps. And there's a complete disparity between what I'm seeing, you know, in one region compared to another. And I'm amazed because, you know, banks talk to each other, they learn from each other typically, but yet you've still got this problem. And as a consumer, if I can't use an app, or if it's too cumbersome and too complex, I'm not going to use it. So banks really have still got a lot to learn, I feel. You know, there's the back-end piece that I've talked about, which needs to be resolved as a priority. And of course, at the front end, it's still not there. So the two don't really marry up, which is why you've got this fintech effect. People coming in and trying to offer, you know, banking services. You've got Facebook, Google, Amazon, all trying to kind of make a play into that because they're picking up on all these problems that exist here. Okay, I'm not a technical guy, but I thought this was quite a good slide to use. And the company I work for in Singapore, we're kind of playing in this space. So we've talked about the back end, the core banking part. We've talked about the front end, the channels and the devices and so on and so forth. Here, in the middle, the middleware part is quite critical. Now, banks, some of the tier one banks will be doing a lot of this stuff themselves. They'll be working on their own APIs. They'll be working on their own services. They'll probably be working with some partners. Tier 2, Tier 3, Tier 4 banks will need help to a certain degree. They'll need a digital banking solution provider. This could be people like FIS, Temenos, Mysis, Oracle, you know, these guys that have these kind of solutions that can help with plugging in that middle part. And actually, that is the most critical part. That's where all your services are going to be derived from, the value-added services I'm talking about here. And for banks, that is the most crucial part. So whenever you talk to a bank, you'll probably see some slide that's very similar to this in terms of their current setup in the middleware part. And that is actually quite critical in terms of the future of their digital banking services. If they can get that part right, they're almost there. Obviously, the bottom part, the back end, the front end, also critically important. But that middleware part, in terms of the services that you can offer, are quite critical. Okay. Another key part here is the user experience. So, wouldn't it be great if there are any people that invest, you know, work with wealth management people and so on and so forth, then this is also quite relevant too. Wouldn't it be great to have a 360-degree view of all your portfolio and banking services, all in one? Rather than having to go to one place, another place, another place to kind of consolidate it yourself, well, this comes down to experience, the customer experience. And most customers would like this. If I were to say to you, I can give you a 360-degree view of your current banking portfolio, you'd be like, oh yeah, brilliant, where do I sign? So most banks are looking to do something similar like this, provide this 360-degree view. Now, can they do it alone? Not quite. They have to work with partners in order to enable that. But this all stems around data. And data is actually quite a critical thing here, because they need to understand the products that you're using, how you're using them, to be able to present this view. And of course, then the data is then linked to campaigns that they can send you, offers they can send you, and really kind of just buy you in to a certain degree. And of course, internally, they'll monitor how well they're doing. So are you responding to these campaigns? You know, what's the feedback like? So they're kind of doing this to a certain degree, although it's still very nascent. number of financial institutions were surveyed. So they were asked the question, okay, guys, you work in this industry, where do you see it going? What are the sort of the main areas that you think are going to make a difference in the retail banking segment, which makes up a large chunk of banking generally? So the top one that came out was the customer journey and removing the friction. Now there's a surprise, right? We all know that's a problem, and it came out on top. The other ones were the use of big data, AI, advanced analytics, and so on, and improving that multi-channel experience that I talked about. So it not being fragmented, it being consistent. So they know the challenges. It's not as if they don't. It's a case of what are they going to do about it, which is where we can help them to a certain degree. I talked about fintech and collaboration. Well, this is pretty critical. If a bank wants to be able to develop new products and services, they're going to have to think about working with fintech providers. Now, of course, banks and fintechs, there are pros and cons. Banks are very good at the regulation side of things. They understand the regulation impact, the compliance impacts, and so on. They have money. They have a great network. And they have a huge customer base. If you look at fintechs, they don't have that, really. What they do have is that they're quick, they're nimble, they can integrate products very well. Technically, they're very savvy. They have a different culture. If you work in a corporate, work in a fintech, you'll be like, oh, this is a different world altogether. APIs are very important. I'm not going to dwell too much on APIs per se, but they are the sort of critical thing for most banks and most fintechs in order to work together. So be it a regulatory sandbox that the governments have set up, or be it a bank that's running their own accelerator program, they will use APIs as a tool to kind of work together to interconnect these companies as well. Okay, this is my last slide. So what is the future of digital banking as I see it? I wrote an article saying we're not actually in an era of digital banking. We're actually in an era of digitized banking. So what I could do physically years ago, we've just digitized now, right? That's all we've done. That is the present, that box on the far side. It's not digital banking, it's digitized banking. Digital banking is the center box. So what we're doing is that we're improving the experience, onboarding, we're personalizing services, and we're leveraging new tech and emerging tech. We're not doing that right now, truth be told. We're trying to, but we're not. We're not there yet. That's the future. And of course, the reality is, what I've highlighted in the blue box here, is that banks still need to go through this digital transformation piece. They're not there yet. And if they say they are, then I'm sure they're not telling the truth. Onboarding is still a problem. How challenging is it to onboard onto a new product? Very difficult. They have lots of data, but are they actually learning from it? I don't think they are. They're struggling. They don't have the tools, the knowledge, and the know-how. They have to work with fintech companies in order to properly utilize that. And a lot of the current services, and I talk globally, not just in India, but just globally, some of them aren't really fit for purpose. So this is quite critical. So there's still a lot of work to do. The transformation effort is still, I think, a number one priority. And sorting out the back-end systems as well, before you even look at the front end and before you even look at new and emerging tech. I think that's it for me. So any questions?
Thank you first for the excellent presentation. You mentioned about open banking or how the banks are going to open up their APIs for other providers. So in Europe, you see that happening. So when it is going to happen in India, like what is the scenario?
So a lot of open banking really depends on what the government wants to do, the regulator wants to do as well. And also, it really depends on, so in Europe, in the UK, consumer demand, to a certain degree, really shake things up there to a point. And the regulators kind of accepted that, okay, there needs to be a change to a certain degree. There needs to be a sharing of data, consumer data, to allow other incumbents to come on board and to compete to a certain degree. Banks have had it quite easy, because it's kind of a monopoly to a certain degree.